We are now surrounded by the joy and beauty of the Easter season. Where I live in the Bay Area, the air is filled with the lovely smell of flowers, and new green leaves dance in the gentle wind. Moments like these remind me of today's responsorial psalm, "Sing a new song to the Lord." The swaying leaves look like they are singing a new song to the Lord. Maybe we should also sing a new song in the midst of Easter mystery of daily life. In the readings of this Sunday, I'm struck by many familiar words such as love one another, I have called you friend, and remain in my love. These words are so beautiful in describing our faith, but at the same time, these words are so familiar that sometimes they can almost sound like a cliche. We have all surely heard these words thousands of times. That is why these popular words can come across as almost flat. So, how can we read these passages so we can continue to be inspired and receive something unexpected? I believe that we read the passages remembering that the New Testament was written in the light of resurrection. The passages would create new meaning. Before we go into the text, imagine what happened to the lives of disciples. The disciples who had innocently fallen in love with Jesus physically stayed with him until he died. Such an event could be life-changing, shocking, or even traumatic, watching the death of a teacher. And then at the point when the disciple experienced the resurrection of Jesus and their own transformation in receiving the Holy Spirit, I can imagine how overwhelming the experience probably was. Actually, it was probably the moment when they began to reflect on how they met Jesus and what their friendship with him meant. And most importantly, who Jesus was. At that moment of a great transition, the disciples must have remembered what Jesus said to them, "Remain in my love." In John's Gospel, the word "remain" in Greek meno, which is translated as abiding, belonging, or dwelling, was an important word, so that was used over 30 times in the text. In chapter 15, the phrase, "remain in my love," sounds almost cozy, indicating an intimacy among friends. However, soon, these words would challenge the disciples because the words would no longer indicate physical belonging or intimacy. They could have reflected on the word, "remain in my love," within an atmosphere of fear and disappointment over the cross. The disciples could have remembered those same words when they were confused and perplexed by the resurrection and at the moment of receiving the Holy Spirit. Sometimes we are okay being sad and frustrated, but not okay in moving on to unknown terrain, including joy and excitement. Moving on is challenging because it requires us to expect the unexpected. Openly read the Bible to gain a sense of security. However, the message of Jesus is contradictory, instead challenging us to open up to a new reality. Paradoxically, remain in my love does not mean to stay, but rather to live for the unknown. The first reading, which comes from the Acts of Apostles, demonstrate that the early Christian community grew through boundary crossings. It is a good example of remaining in his love. The disciples who experienced the resurrection were forced to cross their own limitations and embrace new things beyond their imaginations and frameworks. Here, the only task is to be passive, to tune in, and to follow the direction of the Holy Spirit, which is often the very spirit of listening and discernment. We hear that Peter crossed his cultural and religious boundaries with a discerning spirit. As a Jewish man, he visited Cornelius, who was a Roman soldier. This story is crucial for the book of Acts in that the disciples in Jerusalem recognized that the gospel was also for Gentiles. The disciples had to admit new communities that were beyond their own cultural norms and comfort. They had to acknowledge that the growing community was not simply a copy of the existing Jewish community. They were no doubt surprised that the Holy Spirit was poured upon unbaptized foreigners. We humans generally like to rely on order and parents because they give us a sense of security. However, the situation with the disciples was totally different, and Peter discerned the situation and continued to open up to the new reality, rather than trying to control and manipulate it. Therefore, paradoxically, we must admit that remaining in His love means going on to unknown land and people, or going to unfamiliar people or cultures with a discerning and opening spirit. When all kinds of cultural boundaries cross, the activity of the Holy Spirit will be manifest. And when we embrace all kinds of unexpected reality, we can then sing a new song to the Lord. In the spirit of discernment and listening, when we dare to cross boundaries and to embrace the stranger or the unfamiliar, we can remain in Jesus, and we can make a fresh new song to the Lord.